Imagine walking into a courtroom where silence weighs heavier than the walls themselves. A man stands accused of a crime, and before a single word is spoken, your eyes fall on him. You notice the way his shoulders slump, the faint twitch in his expression, perhaps the clothes he wears. In that instant, without meaning to, you form a judgment. That single moment plants a seed, an anchor so powerful that every piece of evidence you hear afterward bends itself to fit the first impression you unknowingly accepted. This is the core of anchoring bias, the psychological trap where the first thing you encounter sets the frame for everything that follows. It does not matter if the first impression is accurate or entirely misleading. It becomes the starting point, the silent reference that shapes your decisions and blinds you to what comes next. Whether you are negotiating a salary, evaluating a product's price, or meeting someone for the first time, that initial anchor pulls you in and does not let go. In the study of dark psychology, anchoring bias is among the most insidious forces of human behavior. It does not scream for attention. It slips past awareness and hides in the background of your mind, guiding your thoughts without asking permission. The brain, constantly searching for ways to save effort, loves shortcuts, and the first impression is the shortcut it trusts the most. That is why people fall for it so easily, even when they believe they are thinking rationally. Consider the first time you met someone who later became important in your life. Perhaps you instantly liked them because they spoke confidently or smiled at the right moment, or perhaps you dismissed them because they appeared disinterested, only to discover later that they were simply shy. That first impression set the anchor. Every interaction that followed was filtered through it, reinforcing what you already believed rather than what was true. This is not rare, it is the default. Entire industries exploit this flaw. Marketers know that the first price you see will determine how every price afterward feels. Show you an expensive option first, and suddenly everything else seems reasonable. Politicians craft their opening lines with precision, aware that the first words you hear set the emotional tone for everything that follows. Media outlets do the same with headlines, framing entire narratives in a single sentence, so that the first impression colors every interpretation that comes after. Anchoring bias is not just present in these moments, it is the tool that makes them effective. The danger lies in how invisible it is. Anchoring bias does not feel like manipulation. It feels like thinking. You believe you are evaluating facts, comparing options and weighing evidence, when in reality you are orbiting around a single piece of information planted at the very beginning. Worse still, anchors do not stay isolated. A first impression about one person can ripple outward into judgments about entire groups, forming stereotypes and assumptions that harden over time. Anchors spread like quiet roots beneath the surface of thought. The research behind this bias is as unsettling as it is revealing. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman famously demonstrated that even meaningless numbers could anchor decisions. In one experiment, participants spun a wheel of fortune rigged to land on a specific number. Afterward, they were asked to estimate unrelated statistics. Those who saw a higher number gave higher estimates, and those who saw a lower number guessed lower. The number on the wheel had nothing to do with the question, yet it controlled their thinking. This showed, beyond doubt, that human reasoning is not purely rational. It is profoundly influenced by irrelevant impressions. You might believe that awareness protects you. It does not. Even people trained in psychology fall for anchoring bias, because the mind does not ask for permission to create the anchor. It simply does it. By the time you realize what has happened, your perception is already altered. The most dangerous anchors are not the obvious ones, but the ones you never notice, the ones that feel like your own thoughts. Anchoring bias is not just a theory discussed in textbooks. It is a silent architect of judgment. It influences who you trust, what you buy, whom you vote for, and even how you see yourself. Every first impression carries the potential to shape choices you believe are entirely your own. In reality, those choices may be nothing more than echoes of a moment you barely remember. Imagine believing that every choice you make is deliberate and carefully considered. You weigh the options, think about the outcomes, and decide what feels most logical. This belief gives comfort because it supports the idea that you are in control of your mind and your decisions. It is also one of the most persistent illusions that human psychology continues to reinforce. The truth is that most decisions do not begin with pure reasoning. They begin with an anchor, an initial impression, or the first number you see that frames everything that comes after. Anchoring bias works quietly in the background by setting a baseline in your mind. From that moment onward, every new piece of information you process is shaped by the anchor. You feel as if you are reasoning freely, yet your thoughts are being pulled toward the first thing you encountered. This false belief is strengthened by the culture you grow up in. People are taught from an early age to trust their instincts, to listen to gut feelings, and to value first impressions. These sayings become habits, passed down through families and communities. Most people never question them because they seem to work well enough. The mind naturally confuses confidence with truth. The first impression feels real, so the rest of the decision bends to fit what was felt at the start. Dark psychology thrives on this illusion. The stronger your belief in your own rationality, the easier it is for someone to influence you. A skilled manipulator does not need to control every thought you have. All they need to do is control the first thing you see or hear. Once the anchor is set, you adjust every conclusion around it without realizing you are doing so. A high price placed next to a discount, a dramatic headline before a story, or a single rumor before meeting someone. Each of these sets an anchor that can shape judgment long after the moment has passed. Real life is full of examples that prove this. In a salary negotiation, the first number mentioned will almost always pull the final agreement toward it. In a courtroom, the first detail introduced can sway the thinking of a jury, even if later evidence completely contradicts it. In personal relationships, first impressions about someone's character can remain strong even after months of seeing evidence to the contrary. Anchoring bias makes first impressions stubborn and resistant to change. The danger is not only that you misjudge others, the deeper danger is that you misjudge yourself. Anchoring bias does not simply affect how you view other people or events. It affects how you see your own worth, abilities, and potential. A single failure can become an anchor that drags down your confidence for years. A single compliment can inflate your self-image beyond what is realistic. The anchor quietly decides how you interpret every success and every setback afterward. Psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman provided clear evidence for this phenomenon. In one of their studies, people were exposed to irrelevant numbers, such as the last digits of their social security numbers. Even though these numbers had nothing to do with the question they were asked, participants still used them as reference points when making unrelated estimates. The results were alarming. Human judgment was shown to be vulnerable not just to meaningful information, but even to random and meaningless impressions. When you fully understand this, you start to question how much control you actually have over your own decisions. Are your thoughts truly independent, or are they quietly shaped by anchors you barely notice? This is not a comfortable realization, but it is necessary if you want to see clearly. Anchoring bias forces us to confront the unsettling truth that the human mind is not as free as it likes to believe. Recognizing the presence of this bias is the first step, but recognition alone does not remove its influence. Anchoring works automatically and often invisibly. Even people who study this phenomenon continue to fall for it. Admitting that you are vulnerable is not weakness. It is a starting point that allows you to pause and challenge the first impression, rather than accept it as unquestionable truth. Anchoring bias exposes a harsh reality. Rational thinking is not the natural state of the mind. The natural state is to anchor and then adjust, and then justify. Most people never realize this is happening. That is why first impressions hold so much power in shaping lives, relationships, and even entire societies. The comforting lie that you are always rational keeps you blind to the quiet forces guiding you every day. Anchoring bias begins within the deepest layers of human cognition. in the very systems designed to protect energy and speed up decisions. The human brain is a remarkable organ, but it is not built for endless calculation. It prefers efficiency over perfection. To conserve energy, it relies on shortcuts known as heuristics. Anchoring is one of these shortcuts, and it silently influences nearly every judgment people make. When you first encounter a piece of information, the brain latches onto it and treats it as a reference point. This is not a conscious choice. It happens automatically, driven by the way memory and attention function together. The first number you see, the first description you hear, the first look you take at someone's face, all of these instantly shape what comes next. Instead of evaluating every new detail from scratch, the mind adjusts from the anchor it already holds. This is efficient, but it is also deeply flawed. The roots of this process are evolutionary. Thousands of years ago, early humans needed rapid assessments to survive. In a dangerous environment, there was no time to question every impression. A quick judgment about whether something was safe or threatening could mean the difference between life and death. The brain learned to seize the first available clue and treat it as a guide. Although the modern world is far more complex, that same mental mechanism continues to operate. The result is a bias that feels natural, even though it often misleads. Scientific studies have demonstrated this effect repeatedly. In the work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, participants were shown random numbers before being asked unrelated questions. Even when the numbers were completely meaningless, people's answers were still influenced by them. For example, if a high number appeared first, their estimates for unrelated statistics were also higher. This revealed a profound vulnerability in human thinking. The mind does not separate relevant from irrelevant at the first encounter. It simply anchors and adjusts from whatever appears first. Neuroscience provides additional insight into why this occurs. The brain's prefrontal cortex, responsible for higher reasoning, is easily influenced by the amygdala and other regions linked to emotion and memory. The emotional weight of a first impression can overpower rational thought before reasoning even begins. Once an anchor is formed, the brain seeks confirmation rather than contradiction. This process, known as confirmation bias, works alongside anchoring to strengthen its grip. The first impression does not just stay in place, it builds walls around itself, making it difficult to escape. This explains why even experts fall for anchoring bias. Judges, doctors, financial analysts, and negotiators, all trained to think critically, still make errors shaped by anchors. Their knowledge does not protect them from the automatic pull of the first number or idea. The anchor embeds itself so deeply that awareness alone cannot erase it. This is why anchoring bias remains one of the most persistent and dangerous cognitive distortions studied in behavioral psychology. The persistence of anchoring bias also connects to how the brain stores and retrieves memories. Once an anchor is established, subsequent information is interpreted through its lens. This is why first impressions often feel unshakable. Even when new evidence appears, the human mind resists rewriting the initial story it told itself. Instead, it adjusts details to fit the first impression rather than replacing it. This adjustment process is subtle. You rarely notice it happening, yet it shapes the entire narrative of what you believe to be true. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. A person who meets someone at a noisy event might anchor on the idea that the individual is distant or aloof. Months later, after many friendly interactions, that early impression may still linger. Even when the evidence shifts dramatically, the anchor continues to influence judgment. The first impression acts like a hidden filter through which all future experiences must pass. Anchoring bias also affects how groups form shared beliefs. When a dominant voice in a meeting offers an initial opinion, others unconsciously adjust their thoughts toward it. This happens even among highly intelligent individuals who pride themselves on independent thinking. The first idea spoken becomes the anchor, and the group's final decision often reflects that starting point more than any evidence considered later. This collective anchoring is one reason why committees and juries can be swayed so strongly by whoever speaks first. The darker implications of this bias become clear when you look at systems designed to manipulate anchors deliberately. Marketing professionals present high initial prices to make discounts appear more appealing. Political strategists craft opening statements to frame debates in their favor. News organizations choose headlines carefully, knowing the first words people see will color how they interpret the story. These anchors are not accidents, they are engineered points of control. From a philosophical perspective, anchoring bias challenges the concept of free will. If your thoughts are quietly shaped by the first impression you encounter, how independent are your decisions? The bias reveals that human reasoning is often less about discovering truth and more about rationalizing what the mind has already accepted. It suggests that people are not as autonomous as they like to believe. This understanding can be unsettling. It forces you to confront how much of your thinking is influenced before you even begin to analyze. It also opens uncomfortable questions about responsibility. If an anchor can push your judgment without your awareness, are you fully accountable for choices made under its influence? These questions do not have easy answers, but acknowledging them is necessary if you want to recognize how profoundly anchoring bias shapes human behavior. Anchoring bias does not merely affect individual decisions. It influences relationships, institutions, and entire cultures. The way societies set anchors through traditions, media, and education can guide generations without them ever realizing it. This is why understanding where the bias begins is essential. Without awareness of its origins, people remain bound to anchors they never chose, following paths shaped by impressions they barely remember. Anchoring bias does not only shape extraordinary decisions like court judgments or major negotiations, it is present in the smallest and most ordinary parts of life, influencing choices you barely notice. This is what makes it so powerful. The bias hides in plain sight, guiding daily behavior without drawing attention to itself. One of the most common places to observe this bias is in pricing. When you walk into a store and see a jacket listed for an extremely high price, that number lodges itself in your mind. Even if you know you cannot afford it, the first price becomes your anchor. Later, when you see a similar jacket at a slightly lower price, it feels like a bargain. The reality is that both prices may be inflated, but because the first number set the reference, every comparison afterward is skewed. Retailers have known this for decades and designed their pricing strategies specifically to exploit this effect. The same principle applies to food and restaurants. A menu will often list the most expensive item at the very top, not because they expect you to order it, but because it anchors your perception of value. Everything else suddenly feels more reasonable, even if it is still overpriced. Without realizing it, your judgment of what is fair or unfair shifts based on the first figure you saw. Anchoring bias is equally powerful in personal interactions. Meeting someone for the first time, you might form an impression based on their clothing, tone of voice, or facial expression. That single moment can determine how you interpret everything they do afterward. If the first impression is positive, you may overlook mistakes or negative traits later. If it is negative, you may find yourself mistrusting them even when they prove reliable. This explains why changing someone's opinion about another person is often so difficult. The anchor set at the first meeting rarely loosens its grip. The digital world has amplified these subtle anchors. Social media platforms thrive on first impressions. A headline, a thumbnail image, or a single viral post can frame how millions of people perceive an event or individual. Once the anchor is set, even corrections or clarifications struggle to reverse the initial belief. People cling to the first version of the story they saw, often ignoring updated information. This is why misinformation spreads so effectively. The first impression becomes the truth in the minds of many, even when it is later proven false. News outlets and political campaigns understand this deeply. They fight to control the opening narrative because they know whoever sets the anchor first often wins the battle for perception. The framing of an issue, even before all facts are known, can define how the public reacts for months or years. Anchoring bias ensures that the first message echoes longer than any correction that follows. Anchoring bias also appears in education and workplaces, shaping how people are judged and how opportunities are distributed. A teacher's first impression of a student, based on early assignments or classroom behavior, can influence grading and expectations for the rest of the term. If the first work appears strong, later mistakes may be overlooked. If the first work appears weak, improvements may go unnoticed. In professional settings, managers can form anchors about employees within the first week of working together. These impressions quietly guide promotions, assignments, and evaluations, often without conscious awareness from either side. Relationships are equally vulnerable. First dates are especially shaped by anchoring bias. A strong first impression can cause someone to overlook red flags later. A weak first impression can lead to dismissing someone who might have been a good match, if judged more fairly. Over time, people often realize that early impressions were misleading. Yet by then, entire relationships or missed opportunities have already been shaped by the anchor. This bias also extends to self-perception. The first time you fail at a task, that moment can anchor your belief about your ability. Even after years of improvement, the memory of that first failure lingers, whispering doubt when you face similar challenges. Conversely, a first success can inflate confidence, sometimes leading to overestimation of skills. These anchors shape not just how you see the world, but how you see yourself. Anchoring is deeply tied to how society markets ideas and products. Companies intentionally create anchors to steer consumer behavior. A common strategy is price anchoring, where an extremely high-priced item is placed next to moderately priced options. Even if few people buy the most expensive choice, its presence makes everything else seem affordable. Real estate agents do this by showing clients overpriced homes first, so that subsequent houses appear like good deals. The goal is not to inform you, but to frame your thinking before you realize it is happening. The power of anchoring is magnified when combined with repetition. Repeated exposure to an anchor strengthens it, making it feel more valid over time. This explains why advertising campaigns repeat slogans and prices relentlessly. The more familiar the anchor becomes, the more natural it feels. Familiarity is easily mistaken for truth. Understanding how deeply this bias operates can be unsettling. It shows that many daily decisions, from what you buy to whom you trust, are less rational than you would like to believe. The subtle anchors planted throughout your day are not just influencing isolated choices, they are quietly shaping the overall direction of your life, building patterns of judgment that can last for years. Recognizing them does not remove their power, but it is the first step toward weakening their hold. Anchoring bias is not only a flaw in human thinking, it is also a weapon used deliberately by those who understand how the mind works. In the field of dark psychology, anchoring is one of the most effective tools for influencing behavior without resistance. Manipulators, con artists, marketers, and even political strategists exploit it because it works silently and quickly. The victim often never realizes that the manipulation took place. One of the most common tactics involves setting extreme anchors. A salesperson might present a very high initial price for a product, knowing that it will make subsequent offers seem reasonable in comparison. The actual goal is not to sell the first option, but to lower the defenses of the buyer. Once the anchor is placed, even an overpriced second option appears attractive. This principle is visible in luxury goods, real estate, and even everyday retail promotions. The first number frames the entire negotiation, and the buyer adjusts around it unconsciously. Courtrooms reveal an even darker side of this tactic. Prosecutors or defense attorneys may introduce an initial narrative or number, such as a severe sentencing recommendation or an exaggerated estimate of damages. Even when later evidence contradicts that anchor, jurors often adjust their decisions around it rather than discarding it entirely. Studies have shown that sentencing recommendations, even if arbitrary, strongly influence final judgments. This demonstrates how vulnerable human reasoning becomes once the first frame is set. Anchoring bias is also exploited in media and political campaigns. Headlines are carefully crafted to establish emotional anchors before the details are even known. A shocking phrase or dramatic statistic grabs attention and shapes public perception long before facts can be verified. Politicians use this method during debates or speeches. They introduce a powerful image or statement early on, ensuring that everything said afterward is interpreted through that lens. Even if later proven misleading, the initial impression lingers in the minds of the audience. Digital platforms have magnified the reach of these tactics. Social media algorithms prioritize content that anchors users quickly. A striking image, a provocative statement, or a viral post becomes the first impression for millions of people within seconds. By the time clarifications appear, the anchor has already set, and the correction struggles to compete with the emotional impact of the initial post. This is why misinformation spreads so easily online. The first story, no matter how flawed, frames every discussion that follows. Manipulation through anchoring is powerful because it does not feel like manipulation. Victims believe they are making independent decisions. They often defend those decisions even when evidence reveals the anchor's influence. This silent form of control is what makes anchoring bias a cornerstone of dark psychological strategies. It is not about forcing someone to think a certain way. It is about planting the seed that guides them to do it themselves. The influence of anchoring bias is even more profound when combined with emotional triggers. Manipulators often pair anchors with fear, urgency, or desire to amplify their effect. A common example can be seen in limited-time sales events, where a high initial price is presented alongside a countdown timer. The anchor sets the perceived value, and the artificial urgency pressures the decision. The individual believes they are acting rationally, but in reality, they are responding to the anchor and the emotional push surrounding it. This method extends beyond sales into personal relationships. Someone attempting to control another person might create anchors by framing themselves as a savior or authority early on. For example, they might repeatedly remind the other person of an initial favor or a dramatic act of kindness. That memory becomes an anchor, leading the victim to overlook harmful behavior later. The first impression of generosity overshadows later evidence of manipulation. This tactic is frequently observed in toxic relationships, where the initial charm serves as the anchor that blinds the victim to subsequent red flags. Anchoring bias also appears in large-scale propaganda. Governments and institutions throughout history have used it to control narratives. A single striking image, phrase, or statistic introduced at the beginning of a campaign can define how entire populations perceive an issue. Once the anchor is set, every future piece of information is filtered through that initial frame. People who oppose the narrative struggle to break it because the first impression feels embedded in collective memory. This explains why misinformation, once spread, is incredibly difficult to correct. In negotiations, anchoring bias can be intentionally weaponized as part of a calculated strategy. Skilled negotiators know that whoever places the first number often controls the tone of the entire conversation. By setting an anchor far from the desired outcome, they create room to concede while still securing an advantage. The opposing party, even when aware of the tactic, struggles to escape the pull of the first figure introduced. This is why negotiation training often focuses on recognizing and neutralizing anchors before they distort judgment. What makes anchoring bias particularly dangerous in dark psychology is its invisibility. Unlike overt persuasion or coercion, anchoring leaves no clear trace. The victim cannot point to a single moment where their thinking was overtly changed, because the influence began the moment they encountered the first detail. They walk away believing their conclusion is entirely their own. This lack of awareness ensures that anchors can be used repeatedly without resistance. The ethical implications of using anchoring deliberately are significant. While it can be employed for benign purposes, such as guiding positive behavior or simplifying choices, its misuse is alarmingly common. When exploited, anchoring bias becomes a silent force that undermines autonomy. It reshapes decisions without informed consent. leaving individuals and even entire societies vulnerable to subtle control. The frightening part is that most will never realize how much their lives are guided by anchors they never chose. Free will is often regarded as one of the defining features of human existence. People believe they choose freely, weighing evidence and making decisions that reflect their values and goals. Yet anchoring bias challenges this belief at its core. If the first piece of information you encounter can quietly dictate the direction of your thoughts, can you truly claim that your decisions are your own? Anchoring bias shows that choice is rarely pure. The human brain does not evaluate every option from an equal starting point. It begins with what it already knows or what it sees first, and adjusts from there. This process is not a flaw in isolated individuals. It is how all minds operate. The illusion of free will persists because you rarely notice the anchor being set. You simply experience the adjustment afterward and believe it to be genuine reasoning. Philosophers have long debated the existence of free will, questioning whether human beings act autonomously or are determined by forces beyond their control. Anchoring bias adds another layer to this debate. It reveals that even when external coercion is absent, internal processes can still undermine independence. The anchor itself may be irrelevant or arbitrary, yet it becomes the foundation for later judgment. What appears to be deliberate choice is often nothing more than rationalization built upon the first impression. This becomes especially clear in experiments where meaningless numbers influence serious decisions. When Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman demonstrated that random spins of a wheel could anchor unrelated judgments, it shook assumptions about rational thought. If something as trivial as a random number can shape estimation, what does that say about the freedom people believe they have in critical decisions? It suggests that free will is less about pure choice and more about navigating anchors set by forces you rarely notice. The illusion of free will is further complicated by how anchors interact with memory. Once a first impression is formed, the brain tends to favor information that supports it. This is where confirmation bias and anchoring bias reinforce each other. Rather than seeking balanced evidence, the mind filters reality to fit what it already believes. A person who anchored high on someone's competence will unconsciously seek moments that confirm that belief, ignoring signs of weakness. A person anchored low will do the opposite. In both cases, the initial anchor quietly shapes the path forward, and the person believes they are choosing freely. The philosophical implications of this are significant. If so much of human decision-making is predetermined by anchors, does moral responsibility remain intact? Can someone be blamed for a judgment that was influenced before they even began to think about it? This question is not only academic, it has real consequences in law, relationships, and social ethics. A juror anchored by a first impression, a consumer guided by an initial price, or a voter swayed by an early headline, may all feel their choice was deliberate, even as it was quietly predetermined. The illusion of free will becomes even more troubling when you consider how anchors are set intentionally by others. The people and systems around you constantly present information in ways that shape your perception before you have a chance to question it. Advertising campaigns, political speeches, even casual conversations can all serve as the moment where the anchor is planted. By the time you begin forming what feels like an independent opinion, the groundwork for that opinion has already been laid. This process is not always malicious, yet it is deeply manipulative. It reveals that freedom of thought can be limited without force or threat. All it takes is the right framing at the right time. A single sentence, a single number, or a single image can establish the path that your reasoning will follow. The unsettling part is how natural it feels. Anchoring bias does not announce itself. It blends into the background of thought, convincing you that your decisions are authentic when they are anything but. Philosophical discussions about determinism often focus on external control, such as fate or divine will. Anchoring bias introduces a quieter form of determinism. It is not about cosmic forces dictating outcomes. It is about cognitive patterns quietly guiding you toward predictable behaviors. Your thoughts are influenced, not by a grand destiny, but by the first impression that enters your mind. This subtle determinism is difficult to accept because it undermines the narrative of personal agency that people rely on for meaning. Even when individuals become aware of anchoring bias, they cannot fully escape it. Awareness may help delay judgment or encourage seeking additional information, but the anchor still exerts pressure. The initial impression remains the starting point, even when actively challenged. This is why people often overcompensate or undercompensate rather than eliminate the anchor altogether. The bias is not easily removed because it is rooted in how the human mind processes information at its most fundamental level. The societal implications of this are immense. Entire legal systems, markets, and public debates operate on the assumption that people are making free and rational choices. Yet if those choices are shaped by anchors planted in subtle ways, fairness and autonomy become fragile concepts. A jury's verdict, a consumer's purchase, or a voter's decision can all be swayed long before any conscious deliberation begins. The appearance of freedom masks the reality of influence. This does not mean free will is meaningless, but it does mean it is conditional. True autonomy requires awareness of the forces that attempt to shape judgment. Without that awareness, freedom is reduced to the illusion of choice within boundaries you never set. Anchoring bias is one of those boundaries. It narrows possibilities and directs decisions while allowing you to believe you are navigating freely. Recognizing this truth can feel uncomfortable, yet it is the first step toward reclaiming some measure of control. Anchoring bias ultimately exposes the fragility of human independence. It reveals that the sense of freedom people hold so tightly may rest on foundations they rarely see. In the quiet influence of first impressions, the question is not whether free will exists, but whether it survives the anchors that silently guide it. Anchoring bias does not stop at the level of personal judgment. It expands outward, influencing entire groups, institutions, and even generations. When anchors are set on a collective scale, they become cultural truths that guide behavior without being questioned. These anchors are powerful because they feel like reality itself. People grow up inside them and rarely notice that their views of fairness, value, or morality were framed long before they could decide for themselves. Cultural anchors appear in many forms. Historical narratives are one of the most enduring. A single version of history, repeated often enough, becomes the lens through which a society interprets its present and imagines its future. The first story told about a nation's founding, its heroes, or its struggles acts as an anchor for national identity. Even when historians later uncover conflicting evidence, the first narrative often persists because it is deeply tied to collective memory and pride. This is why myths about nations remain powerful long after they are proven incomplete or false. Media plays a crucial role in reinforcing these societal anchors. The first headlines that emerge after a crisis or scandal shape public perception for years to come. People rarely revisit the initial framing. Even when new information appears, news cycles move quickly, but anchors set in the opening moments can linger in public consciousness for decades. The result is a society guided by impressions rather than evolving facts. Education systems also contribute to collective anchoring. The way subjects are introduced to children sets the foundation for how they perceive entire fields of knowledge. A biased introduction to history, economics, or even literature can shape attitudes long into adulthood. If the first explanation of a concept is oversimplified or distorted, it can anchor thinking so strongly that more nuanced understanding struggles to take hold later. Economic systems exploit these anchors as well. The first exposure to wealth inequality, market pricing, or job opportunities creates expectations that influence how people engage with the economy for life. When someone grows up believing that certain levels of wealth or status are unattainable, that belief becomes an anchor that limits ambition. Conversely, inflated expectations set by early privilege can distort reality when confronted with challenges. Both forms of anchoring shape collective patterns of success and frustration. The most striking aspect of these societal anchors is how invisible they are. Individuals often believe their views are personal, yet those views emerge from frames that were set by culture long before they were born. This creates a paradox. People argue passionately about values and choices, unaware that the foundation of their beliefs may have been anchored by forces outside their control. The result is a collective illusion of independence shared by entire communities. Anchors that guide entire societies often become so deeply embedded that they shape laws, traditions, and moral codes. Once established, these anchors influence every debate and reform that follows. Consider how economic policies are framed. The first standard of what is considered normal for wages, taxes, or prices often becomes the unspoken baseline. Even when society undergoes significant changes, people instinctively compare new proposals to that old anchor rather than evaluating them on their own merits. This is why reforms that deviate too far from established norms face resistance, even when evidence supports their benefits. Collective anchors are also reinforced through rituals and symbolic acts. National holidays, ceremonies, and even shared moments of grief or celebration create emotional impressions that stay fixed in public memory. These experiences form anchors that future events are compared to. A tragic disaster might permanently frame a community's sense of vulnerability, while a great victory can anchor national pride for generations. Both positive and negative anchors shape how entire populations interpret the events that come after. The influence of anchoring bias in group settings extends to public opinion and social movements. When a controversial idea is introduced for the first time, the framing of that introduction determines whether it is viewed as radical, reasonable, or unacceptable. Over time, repeated exposure can shift this anchor, gradually moving what society considers acceptable. This phenomenon explains why certain social changes, once unimaginable, later become normalized. It also explains why some outdated beliefs persist, stubbornly, protected by anchors that have not yet been replaced. Technology and digital media accelerate this process. The first viral story or image to emerge during a major event sets the tone for how millions of people interpret it. Even when fact checks appear later, the initial impression often dominates. In the digital age, speed determines influence. Whoever sets the anchor first gains control over the narrative. This has profound consequences for public trust and societal division, as competing anchors can split populations into opposing realities that feel equally valid to those inside them. The danger of collective anchors is their scale. An individual can challenge a personal anchor with effort and reflection, but challenging a cultural anchor means questioning everything familiar. Few people willingly disrupt the beliefs that tie them to their community. This is why manipulative leaders and institutions can hold power for so long. By controlling the anchors of collective identity, they control the framework of debate itself. People argue within boundaries that were set for them, rarely questioning the foundation beneath their disagreements. Anchoring bias at this level shows that societies are not entirely rational any more than individuals are. They are guided by impressions, narratives, and emotional cues set at key moments in history. Understanding this reveals why social change is difficult, why polarization persists, and why some myths endure long after they are disproven. The anchors of collective society are heavy, and most of them are never lifted. Understanding anchoring bias at an academic level is valuable, but the real challenge lies in recognizing its presence in your own thoughts. This bias operates so subtly that most people never notice it influencing their decisions. They believe they are acting freely, unaware that their first impressions are quietly steering every judgment that follows. Becoming aware of these anchors requires slowing down and examining the moments where your thinking begins. Anchors often reveal themselves in everyday decisions that seem harmless. Think about the first time you check prices when shopping online. The very first item you see sets your expectation of what is expensive or affordable. Even if you continue searching and find better deals, That first price lingers in your mind, shaping how every subsequent option feels. The same effect occurs when you browse real estate listings, consider salary offers, or evaluate restaurant menus. The initial figure becomes the frame, even if it has no logical connection to your final choice. Recognizing anchors in personal interactions can be even more difficult. When you meet someone for the first time, your mind automatically forms an impression based on subtle cues, such as appearance, tone of voice, and posture. That impression may feel accurate, but it is only a snapshot. As the relationship continues, you are likely to interpret new information in a way that supports your original judgment, rather than challenge it. This is why first impressions are so difficult to undo. Once the anchor is set, it colors everything that comes after. Self-reflection reveals another layer of anchoring. Your views of your own abilities, worth, and potential are shaped by anchors set in earlier experiences. A single failure in childhood can become an anchor for how you see yourself in adulthood. The same is true for early praise, which can create expectations that later feel impossible to meet. These anchors are particularly powerful because they are internal. They do not simply influence a single decision, they shape your identity. The digital world creates additional challenges for recognizing anchors. Algorithms on social media feed you information that reinforces your first impressions. The first headline you see about an event may not be accurate, yet it sets the tone for every update you read afterward. This explains why debates online become so polarized. People are not just arguing over facts, they are anchored to different first impressions and cannot easily see past them. The process of identifying anchors in your own thinking requires deliberate effort. It begins with noticing when a first impression is forming and questioning its validity. This does not mean dismissing instincts entirely, but it does mean pausing to consider whether the first detail you encountered deserves the influence it holds. Without this pause, you risk mistaking the anchor for the truth. Recognizing anchors becomes even more important when decisions carry long-term consequences. Choosing a career path, committing to a relationship, or making financial investments are all areas where first impressions often dominate. The first salary you are offered can influence how you value your work for years. The first impression of a partner's behavior may blind you to patterns that emerge later. Even the first home you tour can distort how you evaluate every property that follows. Each of these moments demonstrates how anchors do not simply affect isolated choices, they shape the entire framework of future judgment. A practical way to uncover anchors is to revisit decisions after time has passed. Ask yourself what influenced your thinking at the start, and whether that initial detail still holds the same weight. Often you will notice that what felt so convincing in the beginning loses its power once you gain distance. This reflection can reveal how much of your reasoning was tied to a single moment, rather than the full scope of evidence. By identifying these patterns, you begin to separate instinct from influence. Another strategy is to expose yourself to multiple starting points deliberately. Instead of allowing the first number or impression to dominate, seek out several frames before forming an opinion. For example, when researching a major purchase, compare sources from different vendors and regions. When meeting new people, withhold judgment until you have seen them in varied situations. This practice does not eliminate anchoring bias entirely, but it weakens its grip by creating competing anchors that balance each other. It is also important to recognize emotional anchors. Certain feelings, such as fear, excitement, or nostalgia, can act as anchors just as powerfully as numbers or facts. A memory of failure may anchor you to hesitation, while a moment of triumph may anchor you to unrealistic confidence. Becoming aware of emotional anchors allows you to question whether your current feelings are based on the present or on echoes from the past. This self-awareness is not about perfection, but about freedom. When you begin to see anchors for what they are, you gain the ability to question them instead of obeying them blindly. This shift can transform how you navigate choices, relationships, and even personal goals. Anchors lose much of their power when they are brought into the light. They thrive in silence and disappear when named. The process is uncomfortable at first. It forces you to confront how often you mistake first impressions for truth. Yet over time, this discomfort becomes liberating. You realize that you are not bound by the anchors you inherited from past experiences, culture, or fleeting emotions. You can choose to challenge them, and in doing so, reclaim the clarity that bias has quietly stolen. Recognizing anchors is not just about understanding psychology. It is about regaining control over your own mind in a world full of unseen influences. Breaking free from anchoring bias begins with an acknowledgement that no one is immune to it. Awareness is the foundation. Without recognizing that first impressions and initial numbers quietly frame thinking, every attempt to resist the bias will fail before it starts. The goal is not to erase anchors entirely, which is nearly impossible, but to weaken their influence and restore deliberate thought to the decision-making process. One of the most effective methods is slowing down the pace of judgment. Anchoring thrives on speed. The faster you decide, the more likely you are to rely on the first impression. Pausing to gather more information interrupts this automatic process. In practice, this means taking deliberate steps to avoid reacting immediately to the first number, headline, or opinion you encounter. In negotiations, this could mean refraining from accepting or countering the first offer until you have done independent research. In personal interactions, it could mean withholding final judgments until you have observed patterns rather than single moments. Another method is exposing yourself to multiple perspectives before forming a conclusion. If you are shopping for a product, do not stop at the first price you see. Seek out a range of comparisons. If you are learning about a controversial event, read sources from multiple viewpoints rather than relying on the first article that appears in your feed. By intentionally broadening your frame of reference, you weaken the hold of any single anchor. Reframing questions can also help. Anchoring bias often locks the mind into a single frame of comparison. By asking different questions, you shift focus away from the anchor. For instance, instead of asking whether a discounted price is good compared to the original price, ask whether it is good compared to your actual needs or budget. This technique redirects evaluation toward meaningful criteria rather than arbitrary ones. Practicing mindfulness strengthens this ability further. Mindfulness trains awareness of thoughts as they arise, allowing you to notice when a first impression begins to dominate judgment. With practice, you can observe the anchor without automatically obeying it. This skill is particularly powerful when dealing with emotionally charged anchors, such as fear or excitement, which can cloud reasoning as much as numbers or facts. These methods require discipline because anchoring bias operates at a subconscious level. The human brain prefers shortcuts, and resisting them feels unnatural at first. Yet each deliberate pause and reframing builds resistance over time. Breaking free from anchors is not about eliminating bias completely, but about building a habit of questioning the first thing that tries to define your perspective. Another important strategy is learning to create your own anchors deliberately. Instead of passively accepting the first impression presented to you, you can establish an internal reference point that reflects your values or goals. For example, before entering a negotiation, decide what outcome would genuinely meet your needs, rather than letting the opposing party's first offer dictate the frame. In personal relationships, remind yourself of your principles before meeting someone new, so that superficial details do not dominate your judgment. By setting your own anchors, you reduce the power of those imposed on you by others. Seeking disconfirming evidence is equally powerful. Anchoring bias works in harmony with confirmation bias, causing people to favor information that supports the first impression they formed. Intentionally searching for evidence that challenges your initial view forces a broader evaluation. If your first impression of someone is positive, look for signs of potential problems. If your first impression is negative, search for indications of strength or reliability. This habit does not remove bias entirely, but creates balance in your perspective. Another technique is delaying decisions when possible. The mind tends to overvalue the first piece of information because it lacks competing data. By waiting and gathering additional input, you naturally dilute the influence of the initial anchor. This approach is valuable in high-stakes decisions like hiring, major purchases, or long-term commitments. Time allows impressions to evolve and prevents the anchor from dominating the outcome. Building awareness of emotional states is also crucial. Anchors are not always numerical or factual. They can be emotional cues, such as fear after hearing bad news, or excitement after receiving praise. Emotional anchors can distort judgment as powerfully as cognitive ones. By recognizing when strong emotions are present, you can pause and ask whether those feelings are connected to the current situation or to an unrelated past anchor. This reflection helps separate genuine insight from emotional residue. Finally, developing a habit of reflection after major decisions strengthens resistance to future anchors. Analyzing past choices and identifying where anchors influence them increases sensitivity to the bias over time. This self-examination builds an internal checklist that alerts you when similar patterns emerge again. With each reflection, you become more skilled at recognizing and adjusting for anchors before they take hold. These strategies are not quick fixes. Anchoring bias is woven deeply into the fabric of human cognition and cannot be erased with simple awareness. However, consistent application of these methods can significantly reduce its impact. The goal is not perfection, but progress. Every time you question a first impression, every time you slow down before reacting, you reclaim a portion of the freedom that anchors quietly take away. Over time, this conscious effort reshapes how you approach decisions and protects you from the subtle manipulations that exploit this powerful bias. Anchoring bias does not only affect individuals or small groups. Its influence extends to the trajectory of entire societies, shaping innovation, policies, and cultural evolution. When the first impression becomes the unquestioned standard, progress slows. The anchor fixes collective thinking to an initial idea, making it difficult to imagine possibilities beyond it. This hidden cost is rarely acknowledged because it unfolds slowly over generations, yet its effects are profound. Consider scientific discovery. Many breakthroughs are delayed not because the evidence is lacking, but because the first accepted explanation anchors thought for decades. Early theories, even when incomplete, become entrenched in textbooks and institutions. New evidence is judged against this anchor rather than evaluated on its own merit. History is filled with examples where transformative ideas were resisted simply because they did not align with the first impression science had adopted. The time lost to these anchors represents countless missed opportunities for human advancement. The same dynamic occurs in economics. Initial standards for wages, pricing, or taxation become deeply embedded in public expectation. Even when conditions change dramatically, people compare new policies to outdated anchors. This resistance can prevent societies from adapting to modern challenges. For example, when the cost of living rises, but wages remain anchored to outdated benchmarks, tension grows between reality and perception. The anchor does not adjust as quickly as circumstances demand, and progress suffers as a result. Cultural norms are similarly affected. Anchors established in earlier generations define what is considered acceptable or unacceptable. These anchors influence attitudes toward gender roles, family structures, and moral values. While change does occur, it often meets resistance, because the first impression of how things should be clings tightly to collective memory. Entire social movements have had to fight against anchors that no longer serve a purpose, but continue to shape behavior out of habit. The hidden cost of anchoring bias becomes especially visible in crises. During sudden events, such as economic collapses or global pandemics, the first narratives that emerge often dominate public perception long after the situation evolves. These anchors guide policy decisions, public reactions, and even historical memory. Correcting these early impressions is difficult, and as a result, societies can remain bound to flawed interpretations of events for years. Anchoring also limits creativity and problem solving. When people approach challenges with preset expectations, They search for solutions within familiar boundaries rather than exploring uncharted possibilities. Innovation requires breaking free from anchors, yet most institutions prefer the comfort of established frameworks. This is why revolutionary ideas often emerge from outsiders who are not anchored to prevailing assumptions. The cost of this bias is measured not only in errors, but in the absence of potential breakthroughs that never receive serious consideration. The weight of collective anchors becomes more apparent when examining historical conflicts and missed opportunities. Wars have been prolonged because leaders anchored to initial strategies or assumptions, refusing to adapt even as conditions changed. Economic depressions have deepened because early policies anchored expectations about what recovery should look like. In each case, the cost of holding on to outdated anchors was measured not only in wasted resources, but also in human lives. Anchoring bias also influences how societies remember and interpret history itself. The first narratives written about major events often shape cultural memory for centuries. These anchors determine who is celebrated, who is forgotten, and what lessons are believed to matter. When new evidence emerges, challenging these anchors becomes controversial, as it threatens the foundations of national identity. This reluctance to revisit anchors leads to repeated mistakes, as flawed interpretations continue guiding future decisions. In technology and innovation, the hidden cost of anchoring bias can be seen in the way industries cling to familiar designs or outdated models. A company may anchor its product development to a single successful version, hesitating to explore new approaches for fear of alienating customers. Entire markets have collapsed because organizations were anchored to what once worked rather than adapting to new realities. This resistance to change slows the pace of progress and allows more adaptive competitors to take the lead. Anchors also shape global inequality. The first impressions that wealthier nations form about developing regions often frame international relations for decades. Outdated perceptions about capability or potential can lead to policies that restrict aid, trade, and investment. These anchors perpetuate cycles of disadvantage by setting low expectations that ignore reviving realities. Similarly, individuals from marginalized groups often face anchors set by stereotypes, forcing them to prove themselves against false baselines before being judged on their actual merits. The most profound cost of anchoring bias is its ability to limit imagination. Human progress depends on the willingness to envision possibilities beyond the familiar. Anchors, however, tie creativity to the first version of reality encountered. Even when conditions demand radical thinking, people unconsciously measure every idea against the old frame. This is why groundbreaking innovation so often feels shocking or even impossible at first. It violates anchors that people did not realize were shaping their sense of what is possible. Breaking free from these collective anchors requires deliberate effort. It demands questioning the narratives that feel natural, revisiting long-held assumptions, and allowing new evidence to reset the frame of reference. Societies that manage to do this move forward more quickly. Those that cannot remain stuck, bound by anchors set generations ago. The true cost of anchoring bias is not only in mistakes made, but in opportunities never seen, paths never taken, and futures quietly sacrificed to the weight of the past. Anchoring bias reveals an unsettling truth about human perception. The first impression, whether a number, an image, or a fleeting thought, has the power to shape how you interpret everything that follows. This influence is not rare or occasional. It is constant. It operates in personal relationships, professional decisions, cultural narratives, and even how societies record history. Recognizing this truth is more than an intellectual exercise. It is a call to take responsibility for how you think and how you allow first impressions to guide you. The greatest danger of anchoring bias is that it hides behind the feeling of certainty. When a judgment feels natural, you rarely question it. You accept the anchor as truth and build your reasoning on top of it. Over time, this leads to patterns of thought that feel unshakable, even when they rest on fragile beginnings. By the time you realize how deeply the anchor has shaped you, Countless choices may already have been made in its shadow. Awareness does not erase this past, but it does create the possibility of a different future. Taking responsibility for this bias begins with humility. It requires admitting that no one, regardless of education or experience, is fully immune. Experts, judges, negotiators, and leaders all fall prey to anchoring bias because it is rooted in the core design of human cognition. The goal is not perfection but vigilance. Every decision deserves a moment of pause to ask whether it is being guided by evidence or by the silent pull of a first impression. Responsibility also involves examining the anchors you set for others. Every word you speak, every image you share, every price you display has the potential to become someone else's frame of reference. In daily interactions, this power can create trust or sow misunderstanding. In larger contexts, such as leadership or media, it can shape public opinion and influence lives on a massive scale. Recognizing this influence is the first step toward using it ethically, rather than exploitatively. Anchoring bias challenges the very concept of free will, but it also offers an opportunity. By learning to recognize and challenge anchors, you begin to reclaim autonomy. You can slow your reactions, seek additional perspectives, and question whether the first impression truly deserves the weight it carries. These small acts accumulate, gradually weakening the hold of automatic judgment and opening space for deliberate choice. This awareness extends beyond personal benefit. When individuals learn to recognize anchors, societies begin to shift. People become less vulnerable to manipulation and less reactive to sensational narratives. They grow more willing to revise beliefs in light of new evidence, fostering a culture where progress is possible. Anchors will always exist, but they do not have to dictate the boundaries of human thought. The journey toward greater awareness is not about rejecting instincts entirely. It is about creating space between the first impression and the final judgment. That space is where reflection happens, where choice becomes possible, and where freedom begins to emerge. It is a small space, but it is enough to change how you live, how you lead, and how you relate to the world around you. As this exploration of anchoring bias comes to an end, consider the anchors that may already be shaping your life. Some you inherited from childhood, some from culture, and some from moments you barely remember. Acknowledge them, question them, decide which ones deserve to stay and which ones must be released. This act of awareness is quiet, yet it is transformative. If this reflection has stirred something in you, share it with someone who may need to hear it. Invite them to explore how first impressions guide their own lives. Encourage them to join you in seeking awareness, not because it guarantees perfect decisions, but because it leads to deeper understanding. Like, subscribe, and stay connected for more explorations into the hidden forces that shape human thought. The next dark psychology insight may challenge what you believe even more than this one, and you may find that recognizing the anchor is only the beginning of learning how to truly see.